Jack, and it is so great to be joining you for Spring Harvest at home. I hope you're having a brilliant day and enjoying this new way of experiencing Spring Harvest. I work at Tearfund in the campaigns team, and in this seminar we will be thinking about the climate crisis. Now that might feel a little bit strange to be thinking about another crisis in the midst of global upheaval where all our minds are fixed on another problem. But this moment could be such a significant one. It's a chance for us to think about what is most important in our lives and to choose how we go forwards. And so in this seminar, I want us to think about the climate crisis through the lens of this current moment, this world that we now live in. So in the next little while, we'll be thinking about what the climate crisis is and unpacking that for you. We'll be considering why this is a unique chance for change. We'll be turning to the Bible for inspiration and a vision of the way forward. And then we'll consider what it looks like for each of us to play our part. So I hope you'll stick with us for this seminar. So what do we mean by the climate crisis? Well, since the Industrial Revolution, we've built our economy on fossil fuels, using it to power our homes and our vehicles and to create a better life for ourselves. But the impact of that has been a rising level of emissions of things like CO2 and methane. And those create a thick blanket around the world. And as we increase emissions, that blanket gets thicker, trapping in the sun's heat and increasing the temperatures. And the consequences of those rising temperatures are melting glaciers, are stronger storms, and many other things that we'll unpack during this seminar. And that is having an impact on all of our lives, whether we've noticed it yet or not. But especially on the lives of the most vulnerable. And it's now at the point of emergency. Our government still invests in fossil fuels overseas, and they are miles off track from meeting their own targets on reducing emissions. And so we're now at the point of climate emergency. But when I talk about the climate crisis, we need to think about it in the context of the wider environmental challenges we now face. The way our society works has pushed creation to breaking point in several different ways. For example, the rate of extinction of species is at a pace we've never seen before. Even in the UK, 1 in 7 species is at risk of extinction. In Australia, if you can remember back to the beginning of 2020, at the beginning of the year in Australia, we saw huge wildfires devastating the nation. And conservationists think that as a result, 1 billion animals died during those fires. And WWF think that that's probably a conservative estimate considering the scale of the fires. And we've all heard lots about plastic pollution over the last couple of years. We've heard about the way it impacts oceans and wildlife. And in our work at Tearfund and in some of our own research, we've discovered the huge impact plastic has on people living in poverty. Every 30 seconds, one person dies from diseases caused by mismanaged plastic and waste. And there are 2 billion people around the world who live amongst piles of rubbish, with no safe way of disposing of them. But despite knowing about these problems, companies like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Nestle and Unilever continue to produce millions of single-use plastic items in developing countries, where people have no safe way of disposing of the items. And then as climate change accelerates, we are seeing temperatures rise, as I said. We're seeing storms becoming more powerful, droughts and floods becoming more severe, all of which are destroying people's homes, lives and communities. And when people's homes are destroyed, or as rising sea levels force them to relocate, they become refugees, vulnerable to trafficking and abuse, and unable to meet their God-given potential. We have pushed creation to breaking point in many different ways. And this environmental crisis is an urgent justice issue. It's a justice issue because the people who have done the least to cause it are already those who are worst affected. In 2016, world hunger increased for the first time this century, and that is because of climate change and conflict. And much of that conflict has been made worse by climate change as a result. It might not be in the news right now, but in southern and eastern Africa, there are 45 million people at risk of severe food shortages because of record floods and droughts and the world's biggest cyclones in history hitting the southern hemisphere last year. Countries like Mozambique, Malawi and Zimbabwe. Countries that are now going into lockdown with limited access to food and resources. The climate crisis is hitting people in poverty. And behind all of these numbers are people created in the image of God. A colleague of mine recently visited Somaliland and met a man named Dakar. Dakar is in his 50s and he lives there with his family. And he's a watermelon and tomato farmer. And he's a really good farmer. In years gone by, he's been able to predict when the rains came, plant his crops accordingly, and make enough to provide for his family and pay for education. But he told us that because of the changing weather patterns, the rains aren't coming at the times that they used to. And in fact, they've had 3 rainy seasons in a row where they've had drought instead of rain. It's people like Dakar, families like his, that are being pushed back into poverty by the way we have damaged God's beautiful creation. Now that was a lot of information and it is hard to hear. It's hard to think of people like Dakar or the millions facing food shortages and the urgency of this environmental crisis. And that's okay that it feels overwhelming. It's okay that it feels heavy. And I want to give you a moment to just let it sink in, to pray and to ask God to be with you as you engage with this. It's hard to think how we even begin to engage in this during what feels like a crazy, unpredictable, and frankly quite scary time. How do we think about something like the climate crisis when we're all trying to work out how to live in this new world? But as we adapt to this new way of living, as we find a new way of life, we're seeing the world in a different way. Our priorities are shifting, community and family are more important than ever before. And it's more obvious now how the old business as usual way of life wasn't working for everyone. So for example, I live in London on what is usually a busy commuter road and is now really quiet. And I'm taking deep breaths outside, enjoying cleaner air than I can remember since living here. And in the old normal, there are about 40,000 people who died from air pollution in the UK alone every year. And somehow we got used to that level of tragedy. On my street and maybe on yours and throughout the country, WhatsApp groups and Facebook groups are starting up to support the most vulnerable and the elderly. Before this crisis, we didn't know they were even there. And as a society, we've got used to the epidemic of loneliness amongst our young people and our elderly. How did we get used to something like that? And as a nation, we're more aware than ever the insecurity that comes with so many of the essential jobs in our society. People who used to be called low-skilled workers are now celebrated as key workers. This global moment is unsettling. It's scary, and I don't want to downplay that at all. This is a scary time. But we will eventually re-emerge from this crisis, and there is an opportunity when that happens. Do we return to business as usual? Do we get used to poor air quality again? Stop talking to the elderly on our streets? And ask the homeless who are now in hotels to go back onto our high street? Or do we reimagine something better, where the poor and most vulnerable are well cared for, and where everyone and all creation can flourish? We have an opportunity as we re-emerge from this crisis to imagine a better world. And as the church, we can be at the forefront of that, of saying we know a God of justice, a God who cares for creation, a God who stands with the vulnerable, and we will pursue that kingdom of God. We will pursue that justice and that equality that God gives us the vision for. And we'll model that to the world around us, not letting go of the things that we have learned during this time, but instead building a better world as a result. Now, the book of Leviticus in the Old Testament was written after the Israelites had lived through years of exile and isolation under the oppression of the Babylonians. And Leviticus is a book that looks backwards to the time of Moses, reminding people of God's provision and promises. And it's also a book that looks forwards. As the Israelites emerge from exile, God casts a vision of a better society, one that doesn't match the norms of the oppressive world around them, but one that is distinct and models the character of God. At the heart of the book, in chapter 25, we find the Sabbath laws. Every seventh day should be a day of rest. Every seventh year should be a time for people to stop working and the land to recover. And after every seventh Sabbath year, so in the 50th year, it was a year to declare jubilee, a radical year of reset for their whole society and economy. A year of jubilee and liberation, where debts are cancelled, slaves are set free, animals allowed to rest, and the land is returned to the original owners. It's an incredible vision, and it's one that God planted in the hearts of the Israelites as they emerged from exile. They were given a vision not to conform to the world around them, but instead to pursue something different that modelled the character of God. And there were three core ideas to this Jubilee year. That it would be a time for slaves to set free and for people in poverty to find freedom. It would be a year where the gap between rich and poor would be narrowed so it never got out of hand. And it would be a year for the land to rest and recover so that creation could flourish and everyone could benefit from that. It's an incredible vision. And as followers of Jesus, we are called to that same vision, to pursue the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. A world where everyone has the chance to meet their God-given potential, where creation is well stewarded and cared for and can flourish for everyone's benefit, and a world where God's justice reigns throughout the world. That is the vision that the Israelites had, and that we can pursue as we emerge from this isolation too. Last year I met Tawange, an ecologist from Malawi, and she is pursuing that better world as we speak. With the help of Tearfund, she established the Malawi Creation Care Network, a group of church leaders and activists and lawyers who came together to say, what is God's vision for this land and this world? And how will we pursue that together? One of the big problems in Malawi is plastic pollution, littering the waterways and the streets and causing all sorts of health problems. And Tawange saw this and wanted to take action. And so she gathered students together from her church and she loaded them onto buses and they drove down to the city of Blantyre in southern Malawi. And she joined with others in the Creation Care Network to organise a protest through the streets of the city. As they got to the edge of the city on their way there were two policemen who stopped her, and she got off the bus to go and talk to them, and they said, we heard about your march and it can't go ahead, we're cancelling it, you're going to have to go home. But Tawonge looked back towards the buses that she'd come on, and she saw all the students coming up with chants and songs for their day. She said the buses were basically vibrating with energy and excitement. And so she looked at these buses full of excitement, and she looked at the police officers. And then she said, "Do you want to tell them that they have to go home?" And the police officers looked at each other, they looked at the buses, and they looked at each other again. And miraculously they said, "No, we don't want to do that." And so they waved to Tawonge and the buses through, and they got to march through the city. And as they did, they were telling street traders and others the impact plastic has on the environment and on people. They did interviews with local media and TV stations, and they told the government that in 10 days they needed to ban soft plastics, otherwise they would be back for another march, and it would be even bigger now people are hearing about it. And within those 10 days, the government passed legislation to ban soft plastics like plastic bags. Because Christians said, we have a vision of a better world, and we will pursue that as we follow Jesus. I'm excited by their story, and I want to invite you to respond alongside them, even while you're at home. I mentioned earlier 4 big companies: Coca-Cola, Nestle, Pepsi and Unilever. 4 of the world's biggest plastic polluters who sell millions of single-use plastics in poorer countries. I would love to invite you, while you're at home, to write them a letter. We've made an example of how you can write to Coca-Cola on our website. If you go to www.tearfund.org/Coca-Cola, then you can find all the resources you need to write them a letter, facts and information, and the address that you need to send it to, and everything else. It would be so good if you could write them a letter to say enough is enough. And as Christians, we believe there is a better way. We've been campaigning to those companies for about a year now and saying that they need to rapidly reduce how much plastic they make. They need to invest in better systems of reusing and recycling, and they need to create good jobs for waste pickers in poorer countries. And we're starting to see progress. Unilever have committed to halving how much new plastic they make by 2025. And the other companies are starting to make some plans too. If we all take action during this time, we really believe that things can change. And there's lots we can do at home as well to start living in a way that cares for God's creation and loves our global neighbours. Perhaps while you're at home, you could grow some food on a windowsill or in your garden. Or you could think about how to reduce your food waste. How can you make the food you've got last as long as possible? When you go for your daily walk, why not keep an eye out for the birds and the plants that you're seeing and praise God for the beautiful creation that surrounds you? Even if it's a weed that breaks through the slabs, take some time to notice God's beautiful world around you. If you have a bit of time, why not think about switching to renewable energy? There's lots of companies that make it super easy. If you go to bigcleanswitch.org, you can find ways of switching really easily, and often it can be cheaper than normal fossil fuel energy too. And as we spend this time in isolation, consider what our new normals will be. How can you reimagine the way that you live? Perhaps it's simple things like reducing how much plastic you use, or starting to eat a few more plant-based meals during the week. How can we as the church be the people who say a better world is possible, and be those, like the Israelites, who start to build it as we re-emerge from this crisis? God, we thank you for your beautiful creation, for this wonderful world that you have placed us in. And we just ask that you would use us as your people to play our part in restoring what has been broken. That you would give us the vision of a world where everyone can flourish. and that you would help us to bring that about through the way that we live, through the way that we speak, and the way that we act as consumers and as citizens. God, we ask, would your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Amen. If you'd like to continue the conversation, then please do join us on social media. On Twitter at Tearfund Act, on Facebook in the Tearfund Campaigners group, or drop us an email at campaigns@tearfund.org. I'd love to hear from you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of Spring Harvest. Thank you very much.